Okay, welcome back. This is the second part of the walk and talk through my notes to the Stephen Lee article or essay, Why Did Weimar Democracy Collapse After 1929? So I'll just jump straight to where we left off. We're looking at the process by which democracy was destroyed and the fact that it happened in three stages. And we're looking at the first stage, which was the period from the summer of 1930 through to the sort of early summer of 1932. In other words, the Bruning era, where it became the norm for Hindenburg to sign off legislation using his constitutional right, Article 48, but the point made was that he was really not following the spirit of the Constitution, but he was allowed to get away with it. We finished off with that crucial point there. He was allowed to get away with that action because of the SPD, because they were very anxious if Hindenburg dissolved the Reichstag, as he did in 1930, remember, and as he was really should have done if he was following the spirit of the Constitution, that he would have to call new elections, and if he called new elections, the SPD would lose votes basically to the extreme left, the communists, or the extreme right. So the SPD tolerated effectively what was an unconstitutional process. Stage 2 then. Okay. The situation changed in September 1932. So this stage here, a resort to Reichstag dissolutions, basically is looking at the end of 1932 and the start of 1933. And basically what happened is that sort of like delayed process where Hindenburg didn't dissolve Reichstags throughout 1930, 31, 32, and the SPD effectively didn't vote against it, and he was allowed to basically rule by Article 48 without dissolving the Reichstag. That was unsustainable, okay? And it changed in September 1932 when Bruning effectively resigned and was replaced by von Papen. And from that point onwards, the SPD changed its tune. They started to attack the use of Article 48. And and as a result, Hindenburg had to do what he had to do, what the Constitution said, that if the Reichstag voted against the use of Article 48, the President had to dissolve the Reichstag. So the Reichstag was dissolved twice in 1932. The first time it was dissolved in July, and the second, well, it was dissolved before July, and the second was in the early autumn. And effectively, constitutionally then, what has to happen within 60 days is there has to be new elections. So there were elections in July 32 and there were elections in November 1932. Now that confronted President Hindenburg with a real dilemma. He could not keep on dissolving the Reichstag for new elections, nor could he constitutionally run the country without the Reichstag, because Article 25 of the Constitution obliged him, if he dissolves the Reichstag, which he has to do if he basically can't, if the Reichstag can't operate, he has to call an election within 60 days once the Reichstag had been dissolved. So he has to do that, but if he keeps on dissolving the Reichstag and new elections, and the Reichstag still can't function because the vote is polarised and therefore there's no coalition that will work, then what does he do? So that's the sort of middle stage. It didn't last very long. It lasted from September to December, or it lasted from the summer of 1932 to the end of 1932. So as a result, caught in that dilemma, he had to move to stage 3. And a nice little quote here: the onslaught on democracy now became more devious, involving plot and subterfuge rather than direct use of the Constitution. So up until now, stages 1 and stage 2, the conservative right wing have operated against the Republic, but within constitutional means. Now we move to stage 3, which is political intrigue. Okay, so what are the key points? The right-wing attack on democracy now moved from distorting the constitution, which is what has happened up to the end of 1932, to actual sabotage of the constitution. Again, a nice quote that. Schleicher, who replaced von Papen as Chancellor in December 1932, now becomes important. He conspired against Hitler by trying to detach Gregor Strasser from the Nazi Party, with half of the Nazi Party with him, to support and join his government. So you've got a new Chancellor who basically is, his solution is to try to split the Nazi Party. Now what that basically did is it made Hitler furious at what Schleicher was trying to do. And so as a result of that, Hitler turned to Papen, who was also aggrieved against Schleicher for the way that Papen had been ousted from the position of Chancellor the month before, because when Papen had been Chancellor, Schleicher had been ousted. Thus, two people, Hitler and Papen, are both aggrieved with Schleicher. They are both motivated by a desire for personal revenge against Schleicher for what Schleicher has done. So Schleicher's political intrigue was therefore highly significant, because what it did is it resulted in the coming together of Hitler and Papen, okay, to bring down his own chancellorship. So when Schleicher asked President Hindenburg to dissolve the Reichstag in January 1933, Hitler and Papen put pressure on Hindenburg not to do that, because instead they had a plan. And that plan basically was to appoint Hitler as Chancellor of a coalition cabinet with von Papen as Hitler's Vice-Chancellor. And because President Hindenburg was caught in that dilemma, he didn't want to keep on dissolving Reichstags, but at the same time he was under pressure to find a solution to the problem. He proved to be highly susceptible to accepting that plan that was presented to him by Hitler and Papen. It provided a way out. Hindenburg was easily persuaded. So Hindenburg was, quote here, was fully in accord with the aim of the right to avoid any possibility of a return to parliamentary government. So those are the three stages, 1, 2, 3. It makes it very neat thinking like that, but of course, and it's a useful revision tool to think of stage 1, routine use of Article 48, stage 2, Reichstag dissolutions at the end of 1932, and stage 3, moving into political intrigue, December 32 to January 33, resulting in Hitler being appointed Chancellor. It's useful to think of it as those three stages, which you can obviously use as an approach in an essay to analyse what was actually happening if you get a question on this. Okay, now to finish off then, Lee, sorry, I just made a mistake there, Lee then moves into going into a little bit more detail about other factors, other reasons why why democracy collapsed. Okay, so what were the other reasons, or I mean they kind of overlap with what we've done so far. So the first of this is really understanding the motivations of the conservative right. Okay, they believed that Nazism was a force that could be harnessed and controlled. None of the conservative right saw Nazism as a danger, because we as historians can see that they were a danger, and they were a danger to the conservative right wing, who, you know, particularly from 1937 to 38, remember the Hossbach Conference and so on, effectively the tiger turned against the lady who was riding the tiger, using Bullock's metaphor. But at the time they didn't see Nazism as a danger. Instead they saw it as a power which could be controlled to serve their own interests. Radicalism, in other words, this is a nice quote, would be the force with which conservatism would destroy democracy. So what the conservative right wanted to do was to take hold of the energy of the radical right wing, the Nazi Party, and use that energy to destroy democracy. So the plan was to replace parliamentary politics with a broad front of right-wing nationalist politicians in association with the army and industrialists. So you've got the right-wing nationalist politicians, Hugenberg, the German nationalist leader. You've got the army and the industrialists, so Schleicher and Tyson, all the entourage who surround Hindenburg. And effectively, you want to create a broad front by giving it mass support on the streets, and this is where the Nazis come in. So the conservative right wing believed that the NSDAP would have no choice but to join that coalition in order to escape the trap that the Nazi Party were in, because they were trapped. Because the conservatives believed that Hitler, from Hitler's point of view, Nazism had peaked, because in the November 1932 elections, the Nazi Party lost seats. They went down from 230 in July 1932 to 196, whilst the conservative right-wing party, the Conservative Party in the Reichstag, Hugenberg's German Nationalist Party, actually their seats went up from 37 to 52. So from Hitler's point of view, Nazism had peaked. Secondly, from Hitler's point of view, he'd had a go at being elected as president in spring 1932 and had lost. So there were two factors that knocked Hitler. So as he got to the end of 1932, a party in decline, he'd lost the presidential election, and in the Reichstag elections they were losing seats, with a leader who'd recently suffered a resounding personal defeat. And so from the viewpoint of the Conservatives, the Nazis were not a threat, they were an opportunity. Bring them in. We can harness that energy, we can control them, because they're past their strength, but they're still powerful and popular. So as a safeguard, the deal was when Papen presented that plan to Hindenburg, in Papen's mind, Hitler would be a boxed-in chancellor. So only 3 Nazis in a cabinet of 12. Papen had the right to be present in any meeting between Hitler and President Hindenburg. And of course there's that lovely quote, which is an original quote. Papen very famously said, "We will have pushed Hitler so far into a corner that he'll squeak." Now, Lee, again a nice quote, "The whole strategy of the conservative right was based on a misconception of proportions unequalled in modern history," which of course we can see as historians looking back at that decision of von Papen to persuade Hindenburg to make Hitler Chancellor, and Hindenburg accepted that decision. It was a huge misconception. Lee then finishes off by looking at another factor we mustn't forget. Clearly, what made the Nazis appealing was they were popular. It was a key factor. Nazi popularity attracted the interest of the conservative reactionary right wing. Again, that's a nice word to use, reactionary, remember, and enticed these conservatives, the entourage who surrounded the president, into making that massive mistake of proportions unequalled in modern history. Okay, so the Depression was undoubtedly important in catapulting the Nazis into being eventually Germany's largest party in July 32, but initially, September 1930 elections, they were the second largest party. Okay, so key points to make there. The increased electoral support was due partly to the conversion of existing voters. Okay, they were diverted mainly from these 3 parties: the German Nationalist Party, the DMVP, the German People's Party, the DVP, and the DDP, the German Democratic Party, which underlies the fact that the defection was at least partly a middle-class phenomenon. So the increased votes that the Nazis got during the Great Depression were largely taken from the middle classes who had previously voted for those middle-class parties. However, the SPD also suffered some defections to the Nazis. It's not as simple as to say that the working class suddenly switched all their vote over to the communists. That didn't happen. The SPD on the whole retained a lot of their vote, but they also suffered some defections to the Nazis, which indicates that radicalised members of the working class were as likely to swing to the Nazis on the far right as they were to the communist left. Okay. So that's the existing voters. Secondly, the increased electoral support was also due to new voters. There were 4 million extra votes in 1930, primarily drawn from young people, but the young people come across all the social classes. The Nazis also gained a considerable increase in support from the industrialists and the business communities, including prominent individuals such as Thyssen. In the last resort, the NSDAP, the Nazi Party, were the only party able to project an appeal to all social classes and to all sections of the population. Nice quote, "It is small wonder, therefore, that the conservative right valued the NSDAP as a channel for the widespread transmission of authoritarian values." So as a conclusion, historians need to avoid monocausal assumptions. The collapse of the Weimar Republic was not solely due to either the assault by the Nazis or the impact of the Great Depression or the alienation of the middle classes. It was a combination. The collapse of the Weimar Republic was also not cut off in its 1924 prime, even before 1939. It had already proved to be highly vulnerable to anti-democratic forces, even before 1929. Right-wing anti-democratic forces were given the chance to undermine and sabotage democracy by the economic crisis of 29 to 33. The Reichstag tried to resist that attack, but the moderate parties were no match for an aging president, authoritarian by nature, who was willing to allow his constitutional powers to be distorted and to be persuaded by his entourage to put Hitler into power through the back door of political intrigue. As Bullock said, Hitler was jobbed into power by a backdoor intrigue. Got to finish there, gone over time. The partner essay in Lee, I'll do a podcast on that, that'll come up soon, which is about what were the alternatives, were there choices, could things have gone in a different direction, what was the alternative to a Nazi dictatorship? Thank you.